When the calculus professor tried to humiliate Big Shaq, the lesson didn't go as planned. Big Shaq didn't walk into that lecture hall for applause, but for answers. The chalk cracked. The board lit up. The equation bowed. Turns out the real test wasn't on the exam. It was buried in assumptions. And when Big Shaq rose, the classroom's definition of genius had to sit down. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The late September air carried a certain weight at Eastworth University, where towering stone buildings, ivy-wrapped archways, and an unspoken tradition of exclusivity loomed over students like silent judges. It wasn't just the prestige or the century-old legacy that set Eastworth apart. It was the belief circulating through faculty lounges and elite donor circles that this was the place where great minds belonged. Not everyone fit that mold. On a crisp Monday morning, a man too large for the standard wooden lecture chairs ducked his head beneath the arched doorway of room 204 in the Durling Mathematics Hall. He moved with a quiet grace, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate. In his gray hoodie and loose jeans, he could have passed for someone's bodyguard or a lost visitor. But he wasn't lost. He took a seat in the back, folding himself awkwardly into a desk that clearly wasn't designed for someone of his size or stature. A few students glanced his way, eyebrows raised. A few more whispered behind laptop screens. Shaquille L. That's the name on the registrar's list. No one questioned it yet. Not even the professor. But some recognized him. Not from calculus study groups or academic journals, but from highlight reels, late-night commercials, and larger-than-life billboards. It was him, Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, NBA Hall of Famer, media mogul, multi-millionaire. But here, he was just a student again. The man himself didn't acknowledge the whispers or stares. He opened a plain notebook, pages uncreased, and pulled out a mechanical pencil with a worn eraser. He didn't want attention. He wanted knowledge. He had come back for something unfinished. Something important. At the front of the room stood Professor Ellington Braxley, tall and wire-thin, draped in a charcoal blazer with leather elbow patches. His salt and pepper hair was combed with precise austerity. His glasses perched with surgical intent. Everything about him screamed control, discipline, and superiority. His first sentence to the class was not a greeting, but a warning. If you are looking for a gentle introduction to advanced mathematics, Braxley declared, his voice a calculated drawl, drop the class. Calculus 3 isn't here to coddle you. It will expose you. A few students chuckled nervously. Shaq didn't flinch. He took notes. Braxley scanned the room, eyes pausing briefly when they reached the back row. He stared a moment too long at Shaq, eyebrows tightening just slightly, then continued with the lecture. As equations and integrals lit up the whiteboard, something else began to simmer beneath the surface. The classroom was a mosaic of privilege. Diamond earrings on boys who never looked up from their MacBooks. Designer bags slouched beside boots that had never touched public transit. Names like Whitmore, Vanden, Callahan. And then there was Shaq. He kept his head low, but his mind moved fast. Numbers danced in his eyes the way a basketball once spun effortlessly on his fingers. He had loved math before he ever dunked. Loved the quiet certainty of numbers in a world that often gave him nothing but noise. By the second hour of class, Braxley began what he called the volunteer trial, an exercise he used to gauge students' real preparedness. Who here, he asked, writing a formidable triple integral across the board, can solve this right now? In front of your peers? Silence. Fingers hovered above keys, but no one moved. Braxley's eyes scanned. Then he did something that felt less like an invitation and more like a trap. You, he said, pointing directly to the back. Mr. Shaquille? Is it? Every head turned. The moment stretched. Shaq blinked slowly, stood without speaking, and walked forward. His sneakers echoed down the narrow aisle. Braxley stepped aside, expression unreadable. Shaq studied the problem, then turned to the board. He didn't hesitate. His hand moved smoothly, filling line after line with careful notation, transforming the chaotic sprawl of symbols into clarity. Braxley's eyes narrowed. The room fell into a stunned hush. When Shaq finished, he capped the marker, turned, and quietly walked back to his seat. Braxley didn't speak. Not right away. His voice, when it came, was clipped. Correct, he said. Then dismissively, though your handwriting needs work. Some students laughed, unsure if it was okay to be impressed. Others leaned in, watching Shaq with newfound scrutiny. Later that afternoon, as class let out, a pair of students passed Shaq in the hallway. Didn't know they let celebs audit classes now. One muttered, "Must be a publicity stunt," said the other. "Or some legacy favor." Shaq heard them. Didn't acknowledge. He wasn't here for their validation. In the faculty lounge that evening, Braxley stood alone, rewatching footage from the lecture hall security cam. He stared at Shaq's solution frame by frame. His brow furrowed. Something didn't sit right. He poured a bourbon from the small cabinet behind his desk, took a slow sip. He had seen gifted students before, but this wasn't supposed to happen. The next morning, Shaq entered early, found his back row seat, and waited. He had already begun the reading for next week. He didn't check social media, though he knew the whispers were growing louder. In a campus forum titled Ivy Elite, a thread appeared. "Anyone else in Braxley's class? The giant math guy. What's his deal?" Replies poured in. Some mocking, some curious. "Looks like Shaq? No way it's actually him. But damn, he solved that triple integral like magic. Maybe he cheated? No way someone like him does math like that." That last line stuck with him more than it should have. Someone like him. Later that week, during a brief break between classes, Shaq sat alone under the stone arch outside Durling Hall. His phone buzzed. It was a video call from Lucille. "You settling in okay, baby?" she asked. Eyes warm, voice soft. "I'm good, ma. Just getting back into rhythm." She studied his face a moment. "They know who you are yet?" He smiled faintly. "Some do. Most don't care. But one? He's watching." Lucille chuckled knowingly. "Don't let their small minds shrink your gift. You walked through fire and still chose to learn." He nodded. "This one's different, ma. He's smart, but cruel, like he wants to prove something." Lucille looked straight into the screen. "Then let your work speak louder than his pride." As the call ended, a gust of wind scattered a few leaves around his feet. Shaq stood, brushing them aside like thoughts he didn't need to carry. He had made a vow before coming here, not just to learn, but to challenge the boxes people tried to trap others in. He wasn't here to prove anything about fame or wealth. He was here because, once in a long-forgotten inner-city classroom, a kind teacher told him he thought in dimensions, and Shaq never forgot that. By the time Friday's lecture rolled around, Professor Braxley had prepared something special. A problem so twisted it had stumped graduate students for years. He wrote it on the board, turned to the class. "This is optional. No grade. Just a challenge. Anyone. No hands. No volunteers. Except one." Shaq rose again. This time without words, without fanfare. Just a quiet step forward. As he began writing, the silence grew deeper. Even Braxley seemed to hold his breath. He didn't just solve it. He rewrote part of it, offered a cleaner method, introduced a variation. When he finished, the class erupted into quiet murmurs of disbelief. Braxley offered no comment. But that night he opened his private journal. Beneath the date, he scribbled 5 words. "He's not who I thought." And across campus, in dorms and dining halls, whispers turned into awe. The man in the hoodie wasn't just Big Shaq. He was something else entirely. The shadow in the lecture hall was beginning to shine. "Ma, it's happening again." Lucille didn't ask what. She knew. She could read his silences better than most people could read books. "They look at me like I shouldn't be there," he said quietly. "Like my answers are a trick, or some kind of joke." She nodded slowly, placing the cup down. "Let them look. You didn't walk into that classroom for them. You walked in for that little boy who used to line up basketballs and pretend they were numbers." He chuckled softly. That boy didn't have this kind of heat on him. That boy had the whole world saying what he couldn't be. And look what he became. This is just a different kind of court. He paused. Braxley's sharp ma. "But he ain't right." "No, he's not. But smart don't mean kind. And power don't mean purpose. You got both." Shaq leaned back in his chair, letting her words settle. She always had a way of balancing him, pulling the noise out of his head without even trying. "Maybe I should have stayed quiet," he said. Maybe solving it out loud was the wrong move. Lucille's voice hardened just slightly. "Don't you shrink for them. You don't owe them comfort at the cost of your truth." They sat in comfortable silence for a beat before she smiled. "Now tell me, did you use that trick I showed you with the Laplace method?" He laughed then, full-hearted and warm.
Yeah.
And I added a little twist. Something I saw in a paper by Narayev. Back in. That's my boy. As the call ended, Shaq stared at his wall of notes again. He thought about how long he had hidden this side of himself. The side that loved solving problems no one else wanted to touch. The side that found solace in structure, even when the world outside tried to box him in. He had walked away from this once. Fame, money, the noise of success had drowned it out. But it was always there. Now he was back. Not as a celebrity, not as an athlete, but as a man reclaiming his mind. The next morning, whispers followed him even before he stepped foot on campus. A new thread had appeared online, under the title, Shaquille the Scholar. Some students were mocking, others were intrigued. A few posted screenshots of his work on the whiteboard from their phones. The comments varied. No way that's real. He probably had someone whispering the answers. Even if he's smart, he doesn't belong in our program. That last one, that was the one that gnawed. By the time he arrived at class, the atmosphere had curdled. It wasn't open hostility, that would have been easier to handle. It was subtler. Seats that used to be open beside him were now mysteriously taken. Conversations halted when he passed. A few fake smiles, polite nods, but the distance had widened. Braxley, as usual, didn't acknowledge the storm swirling beneath the surface. But when he handed out a pop quiz that day, questions deep in complexity but riddled with nuance, he watched Shaq more closely than anyone else. Shaq completed it without looking up, turned it in early, and for the first time, as he walked back to his seat, he met Braxley's eyes. Not with defiance, not with pride, but with clarity. He wasn't here to impress, he was here to learn. That afternoon, in a far corner of the campus library, a teaching assistant named Marcellus flipped through Shaq's quiz paper. He frowned, double-checked the answer key, then leaned back, letting out a low whistle. Every answer was right. Not just right, but written with a kind of confident simplicity that only comes from deep understanding. He walked the paper back to Braxley's office, hesitated at the door, then knocked. Braxley didn't look up as Marcellus entered. He held a paper in one hand, a red pen in the other. I think you should see this, Marcellus said, setting the quiz on his desk. Braxley finally glanced down, studied the handwriting, and tapped his pen once against the margin. Anyone can get lucky once, he said. Then, after a pause, let's see how many times lightning strikes. Outside, dusk began to settle over Eastworth's grand halls. But in room 204 the air was still electric, charged with suspicion, brilliance and a brewing storm of assumptions waiting to be shattered. The word traveled like static electricity through Eastworth's manicured quads and lecture halls, carried in smirks, shoulder taps and cryptic social media posts. The big guy in Braxley's class isn't just a jock. What started as disbelief quickly spiraled into intrigue, and then inevitably into resentment. This wasn't just about a surprise math talent anymore. It was about territory, about expectation, about who was allowed to hold space in a place like this, and who wasn't. By the end of the week, Shaq's presence in Calculus 3 had become more than just a curiosity. It was a disruption. The students who once yawned through Braxley's lectures now leaned in when Shaq raised his hand. The air shifted when he spoke, not because he tried to command attention, but because he made clarity look effortless. He solved problems others hadn't even understood yet. His work was concise, inventive, and most threatening of all, better. Professor Braxley noticed. And while he never let the mask of civility slip, his actions began to mutate, subtle at first, calculated. He started by adjusting the grading rubric, claiming that the previous system was too lenient for the caliber of this class. The effect was immediate. Assignments that once earned A's now returned with cryptic notes like insufficient rigor or unoriginal approach. Shaq's latest paper, a 10-page deep dive into Jacobian matrices, supported by references Braxley himself had published a decade ago, came back with a B- and no comments. It wasn't the grade that stung. It was the silence that followed it. In the days that followed, Shaq noticed the distance. Students who once offered half smiles now walked past him without a glance. Study groups were full when he asked to join. Shared Google Docs mysteriously locked. Even the barista at the campus cafe, who once joked about his height every morning, now avoided his eye and placed his drink a little too far from the counter's edge. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it was real. The isolation took shape in other places too, digital ones. A screenshot of Shaq in the lecture hall began circulating in a private group chat labeled Eastworth Irony. The caption read, "When the 7-foot NBA retiree tries to steal your GPA." The thread snowballed. Comments rolled in. Token genius in action. Bet he's got a ghostwriter for those problem sets. Campus diversity bingo. Big athlete solves math. It was the same old language, polished just enough to slip beneath administrative radar, but soaked in the same contempt you don't belong here, dressed up as sarcasm. Shaq never responded. He didn't flinch, but in the quiet of his apartment, the walls started closing in. He stopped going to the cafeteria. The long tables, once background noise, now felt like stages. Every bite, too loud. Every glance, too sharp. Instead, he packed protein bars and sat beneath the old elm tree behind the humanities building. Headphones in but music off. Watching. Thinking. The hurt didn't come from being underestimated. That was familiar. Expected. It came from how easily the people around him traded wonder for doubt. Respect for ridicule. He had walked into Eastworth to learn, to build, but what he'd found instead was an ecosystem terrified of anything outside its own reflection. Braxley, meanwhile, escalated. During lectures, he began framing Shaq's correct answers as accidentally insightful or unorthodox, though inefficient. He'd highlight other students' incorrect attempts with encouraging feedback, then breeze past Shaq's work without so much as a nod. One Thursday morning, Braxley returned a quiz with a red ink comment scrawled across the bottom. Be cautious not to mimic solutions from past semesters. Academic integrity is paramount. The accusation wasn't direct, but it was loud enough. And the timing? Surgical. Right before a departmental open forum where Braxley presented on maintaining standards in a shifting academic landscape. No names were mentioned, but a slide featuring anonymous student work displayed a problem identical to the one Shaq had solved earlier that week. It wasn't just isolation now. It was erasure. Shaq sat in the third row of that forum, hands folded tightly, jaw locked. He said nothing, but he saw the side glances, heard the chuckles, felt the cold, thin air of doubt wrap around him like a cloak he never asked to wear. That night, he called Lucille again. The screen lit up with her steady eyes. She didn't ask how he was. She could see it in the way his shoulders slouched, in the quiet between his sentences. "They're coming at me sideways now, Ma," he said. "Not with fists, with rumors, with math." Lucille nodded slowly, eyes locked on her son. "They can try to bury you with their lies, but you built your foundation in truth. Concrete don't crack that easy." He sighed. "Sometimes I think maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not built for this place. Not like this." Her voice softened, but it cut deeper than any insult. "That man don't fear your presence, Shaquille. He fears your mind, because he spent his whole life believing brilliance looks a certain way, talks a certain way, comes from a certain zip code. You're a crack in his mirror, and cracks, they spread." There was silence between them, and then she added, "But don't you ever let their fear teach you shame." After the call, Shaq stared at the notes pinned to his wall, equations from his childhood, the first theorem he ever tried to solve on his own. A sticky note from Shawnee that simply said, "You already are enough." The next day he returned to class early, earlier than usual. He waited outside the door, standing tall. A few students passed, some nodding awkwardly, others pretending not to see him. When Braxley arrived, Shaq held the door open without a word, then walked in behind him and took his seat. That morning, Braxley introduced a guest lecturer, a visiting scholar from Belgium, a fresh face, someone who hadn't yet been contaminated by the undercurrent. During a Q&A segment, the scholar posed an open question, a theoretical approach to optimizing vector fields in irregular topologies. None of the students spoke. Shaq raised his hand, and again, without notes, without bluff, he constructed an answer that spun the problem in a new direction entirely. The scholar blinked, stunned. "Are you in the doctoral program?" he asked. Shaq shook his head. "Undergrad." Murmurs filled the room again. But this time, they weren't tinted with mockery. They sounded more like awe. Braxley forced a smile. "He's had some practice." After class, the visiting scholar approached Shaq, asking where he'd published. Shaq only smiled. "Nowhere. I'm still learning." Later that day, an anonymous email went out to the mathematics department. The subject line read, "Concern regarding student favoritism and grading bias." Attached were comparison scans, Shaq's work versus classmates' papers, annotated by someone with deep knowledge of the curriculum. The conclusion was clear. Shaq's grades had been disproportionately lower despite superior content. No sender. No trace. But someone had been watching. Someone who saw through the performance. Someone who understood that erasure, too, was a kind of violence, a kind that left no bruises but made you doubt the worth of your own reflection. By the end of the month, things had changed again. Quietly. Braxley no longer commented on Shaq's work at all. Grades returned marked but unspoken. Students whispered, but with less venom now. Confusion replacing contempt. Shaq kept showing up. Kept solving, kept taking notes. But inside, something deeper was building. A resolve. Not the flashy kind. The kind forged in silence. Sharpened by rejection. Anchored in purpose. He knew now. He wasn't just solving equations. He was dismantling assumptions. One variable at a time. The late-night hum of Eastworth's campus was quieter than usual. As if even the wind had paused to think. From the high windows of Shaq's apartment, the world looked small, blurry patches of light scattered across the quad. Students moving in twos and threes. Laughter echoing in faint, uneven waves. But inside, everything felt still. Shaq sat in the center of the room, surrounded by open notebooks, unfinished problems, and the soft flicker of a desk lamp. But his pencil had stopped moving an hour ago. His mind had traveled somewhere else, far from Eastworth, far from Braxley's whiteboard, far from the sting of anonymous whispers that trailed behind him on campus. The numbers blurred on the page, replaced by something older, something deeper. A memory unspooled, not sudden, not jarring, but soft and slow, like turning the pages of a worn-out scrapbook. He was 10 again, sitting cross-legged on the floor of their small home in Newark. Lucille stood by the kitchen sink, humming an old Curtis Mayfield tune, while Shaq arranged dominoes across the carpet. But these weren't for playing. Each one had a number scrawled on the back, and Lucille would call out puzzled. "I got 4 dominoes," she'd say. "Each has a number from 1 to 9. Put them in a square so every side adds up to 15. Shaq would grin, eyes darting, hands moving like a miniature engineer piecing together his own world. He didn't know it then, but that was algebra. That was logic. That was the seed. And his mother? She was the gardener. She never called it math. She called it fun. And when he got it right, she'd clap and say, "Look at that big old brain of yours." Later, when he grew taller than the doorframe and coaches started calling, math took a back seat. The world wanted a giant, not a thinker. But the dominoes never left him. He kept a set in every locker, quiet reminders of a different language he once spoke fluently. Years later, it was Shawnee who brought that part of him back. It had been the middle of a brutal West Coast road trip. 8 games in 12 nights. His knees ached, his body heavier than ever. They were in a hotel suite in Portland, and she caught him solving a Rubik's Cube during a post-game ice soak. "What's with the cube, Einstein?" she teased. He shrugged. "Keeps the noise out." She raised an eyebrow, walked over, and tossed a book onto his lap. It was worn, spine cracked, pages yellowed. "The Joy of X" by Stephen Strogatz. He looked up at her, confused. "I saw it in the airport," she said. "Figured it was your kind of weird." That night, while the rest of the team gambled or watched film, Shaq lay in bed reading about functions, limits, and imaginary numbers. And something clicked. Not because it was easy, but because it was his. Something he didn't have to perform. Something he didn't need to dunk through or flex for. Shawnee had seen it before anyone else did. And she kept feeding it. New books. Puzzles. Quiet encouragement. "You already know how to carry a team," she once said. "Maybe now you carry something bigger." But then came the injuries. The surgeries. The growing distance. Fame had filled every corner of their life, leaving less and less room for silence. And in that silence, they drifted. It wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. It just slipped. And when she left, she didn't take her books, just her presence. But Shaq kept reading. Now, sitting alone in his apartment, surrounded by symbols and proofs, he felt the weight of their combined voices. Lucille's endless optimism, Shawnee's grounded belief, and all the years in between, where he wore armor for the world, and never let anyone see what lived underneath. His phone buzzed. A message from Nicolette Vance, the soft-spoken student who once thanked him after class for being visible. She'd been kind, reserved, someone who carried her own battles quietly. The message was short. "That solution in class today, don't let them make you shrink. You inspired me again. Just thought you should know." He stared at it longer than he needed to, then replied with a single line. Thanks. That means more than you know. But he did know. Because some days, the isolation wasn't in the stares or the slights. It was in the absence of being seen, truly seen. Not as a legend, not as a spectacle, but as a mind, a learner, a man. He reached over and pulled an old wooden box from his bookshelf. Inside were loose pages, napkins with scribbled diagrams, and one folded photo. It was him and Shawnee in a bookstore, both mid-laugh, a math textbook clutched between them. He looked young, lighter. He closed his eyes and drifted into another memory. This one from his rookie season, in Orlando. After a brutal loss, when media vultures circled and headlines blamed him for missed free throws, he returned to his hotel suite and found Shawnee on the balcony, reading. She handed him a notebook. Inside were patterns, free throw angles broken down into arcs and parabolas. I'm not a coach, she said. But I figured math don't lie. They spent the night adjusting his foot angle by a degree, analyzing muscle memory through statistics. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about understanding the mechanics of trust. Back in the present, Shaq opened his current notebook and flipped past his class notes. At the back in small handwriting were the beginnings of something he hadn't shown anyone yet. A theory connecting spatial logic to rhythm in movement. A blend of calculus and body mechanics. A bridge between who he was and who he was becoming. Braxley would never understand that. Because Braxley had never needed to. He never had to earn his space through contradiction. Never had to prove his intelligence without raising his voice. Never had to make himself smaller so that others didn't feel threatened. But Shaq had, and still did. That's why the class mattered. That's why he stayed. Not to beat Braxley. Not to win some unwinnable race. But to finish something that began decades ago. On a carpet floor with dominoes and laughter. And a mother who saw genius where others only saw size. He knew now that every time he solved a problem in that room, he wasn't just answering equations. He was rewriting history. His own. And maybe someone else's. He reached for his pencil again, and began writing. Not for a grade, not for a curve, but for clarity. Outside, the campus had grown quieter still. Only the occasional footsteps echoed through the courtyard. Inside, the lamplight burned steady, casting long shadows that danced across the pages. The quiet movements of a man reclaiming every piece of himself. Because this wasn't just about math. It was about memory and legacy. And the quiet, relentless power of not letting the world define you by its limited imagination. By the time the notice went up on the classroom bulletin, students were already whispering about it like a ghost story passed between generations. Midterm, comprehensive, closed book, 2 hours. Calculus 3. But the real message wasn't in the wording. It was in the weight. Everyone knew what it meant. In Braxley's class, this wasn't just an exam. It was a rite of passage. Or more accurately, a line drawn in the sand to separate the deserving from the rest. They called it the gauntlet. The legend surrounding the test had grown with each passing year. Horror stories filled student forums, questions designed to deceive, curveballs that tested instinct, not memory. Rumors even circulated that Braxley crafted the exam from old research puzzles he'd never published. For some, it was the first time they'd see a CA. For others, it was the reason they dropped out of the program altogether. But for Shaq, the announcement hit different. He'd been preparing for this moment, long before the bulletin was pinned, not just because he wanted to pass, but because he knew what this exam meant to Braxley. It wasn't just a test of knowledge, it was a performance, and this time, the audience was loaded with bias. In the evenings, when most students crammed in study groups, or watched old lectures, Shaq met quietly in the back corner of the engineering building, near the boiler room, where Mr. Darien kept a mop and a stack of yellowing journals. Few people even noticed the man pushing the janitor's cart. Fewer knew that Darien LeClaire once held a PhD in applied mathematics from Howard, a quiet genius pushed out of academia decades ago, when tenure had less room for black intellects with their own ideas. Darien saw something in Shaq that no one else did, not because of his fame, but because of his thinking, the way he layered ideas, the way he asked questions, the way his solutions sounded like music when you finally understood them. Their sessions weren't flashy, just chalkboards, scribbled margins, and quiet debates over the beauty of Laplace transforms and eigenvalues. Darien didn't coddle, he challenged, and Shaq thrived. You already know what the answer is, Darien told him one night. The only thing that matters now is what story your work tells. Now, with the exam looming, Shaq walked into room 204 with a calm that unsettled even him. The room was packed tighter than usual. Sleeves rolled, heads down, Braxley stood near the front, shuffling papers like a poker dealer, ready to flip the fate of everyone present. When the clock struck the hour, Braxley handed out the packets, each page thick with complexity. A few students flipped immediately, skimming the pages like soldiers surveying a battlefield. One student muttered under his breath, "What the hell?" Shaq didn't look up. He breathed once, picked up his pencil, and started. The test was a maze, multivariable integrals with shifting boundaries, rotating coordinate systems, nonlinear equations buried inside real-world physics scenarios. Braxley wasn't testing memory. He was testing composure, intuition, and the ability to see through the fog. Around him, tension rippled through the room. A pencil snapped. Another student sighed, then buried her head in her arms. Erasers squeaked across paper. Eyes darted to the clock. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the soft rhythm of scribbles and the occasional gasp of disbelief. But Shaq, he moved like a man painting. His methods weren't conventional. He skipped certain parts, came back to them. He changed variables when others wouldn't dare. His margins bloomed with alternate approaches, not second guesses, but explorations. At one point he paused, stared out the window for a long minute, then returned to his work with a quiet certainty that made the student beside him glance sideways. By the time the proctor called 30 minutes remaining, over half the class still fumbled with the first two sections. But Shaq flipped his paper closed, stood, walked forward. The room seemed to freeze as his footsteps echoed across the tile. Braxley didn't look up when Shaq handed him the exam, just took it with 2 fingers, as if touching it too long might confirm what he already feared. Shaq returned to his seat without expression. He waited, not because he had to, but because leaving now would have felt too much like a victory lap, and this wasn't about winning. When the session ended, students stumbled out like survivors. Some whispered, others groaned. A few looked back at Shaq like he was part myth, part problem they couldn't solve. Braxley stayed behind, the stack of exams in front of him like unsorted truths. He picked up Shaq's and read it slowly, page by page. The handwriting was crisp. The solutions weren't just correct, they were innovative. He had used a polar transformation, where others would have brute forced their way through Cartesian madness. He applied a technique from a Russian mathematics paper Braxley had cited once, 15 years ago, in a journal no undergrad should have had access to. But more than that, it made sense. Shaq hadn't just solved the test, he'd interpreted it, rewritten its rhythm, and Braxley hated what that meant. For the first time he didn't feel like the smartest man in the room, and it unsettled him deeply. The next day, the grades were released. Quietly, digitally, Shaq scrolled, found his ID, read the mark beside it. He stared at it for a moment, not in disbelief, but in recognition. It was expected. Across campus, the reactions varied. A few students celebrated scraping by. Others raged in private chats. And a small group, the ones watching Shaq most closely, breathed easier. Because if he only got a B, maybe the world still made sense. Later that afternoon, Shaq returned to the engineering building. Darian was there, leaning against a mop handle, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos older than most of the students. "How'd it go?" he asked. Shaq handed him a printed copy of the exam, with his own annotations. Darian read the first page, then the second, then looked up, eyebrows raised. "He gave you a B for this?" Shaq nodded. Darian didn't laugh. He just sighed.
Of course he did.
They stood in silence for a while. Then Darian said, "You could fight it." "I could," Shaq replied. "But I think the real exam's just beginning." And he meant it. Because Braxley hadn't failed him. He had confirmed something much worse. That in this place, brilliance had to arrive in the right body, with the right accent, from the right lineage, wearing the right armor. But Shaq wasn't interested in playing dress-up for their comfort. He was here to learn, and maybe, to teach something too. That night, as he walked back to his apartment, a breeze kicked through the quad, scattering pages from someone's open binder. A few drifted past his feet, graphs and scribbles, hurried attempts to catch up to a system always 2 steps ahead. Shaq bent down, picked up the sheets, and returned them to the student behind him, a freshman he recognized from office hours. She smiled, embarrassed. "Thanks. This class is killing me." He smiled back, It's not meant to kill you. Just teach you how to survive different. And with that he kept walking tall, calm, and quietly on fire. Because the gauntlet hadn't broken him. It had awakened him. His own exam. It wasn't just the content. It was the structure, the sequencing, the little margin diagram Shaq had drawn next to a boundary error problem. There was no doubt. Shaq had written it. But now it had a new name. A digital myth. The Titan of Tang. Baxley didn't say a word to his TA. He didn't storm into the department head's office. That wasn't his way. He believed in quiet control, and this moment, though humiliating, required something surgical. He closed the browser and leaned back in his chair. To the outside world, it was just a math post. But to Braxley, it was a mutiny. He'd spent 20 years crafting the illusion that intellectual supremacy was measurable, rankable, curatable, that he, Ellington Braxley, had the final say in who belonged in the pantheon of brilliance. And now some anonymous entity had turned his masterpiece into a viral footnote, using his own exam as the canvas. He tapped a pen against his desk, eyes narrowing. There were only a handful of people who could have written that paper, and only one who had both the answers and the reason to stay anonymous. The investigation began quietly. Braxley combed university IP logs, checked the date and timestamps of submissions, even requested IT support under the guise of suspected academic misconduct. He reviewed security footage from the exam room, not to catch cheating, but to watch body language, patterns. He watched Shaq finish early, calm, confident. He watched again and again. Meanwhile, the campus vibrated with tension. Students had caught wind of the Numerium post within 24 hours. Some had already guessed its origin. "It's gotta be him," someone whispered in the rec center. "You think Big Shaq knows what Reddit even is?" "Man, I saw the way he looked at that exam. He didn't just solve it. He owned it." A few were in awe, but others bristled. If he really did post it, that's academic misconduct. It's easy to act humble when everyone's already worshipping your work. He's just showing off. Again, Shaq said nothing. Not publicly. Not online. He didn't have a Numerium account. Didn't even know the post existed, until a week later when a fellow student cornered him after class. "Yo," the guy said, holding out his phone. "This you?" Shaq glanced at the screen, scrolled briefly, then shook his head. "Never seen it." The student grinned. "Still, feels like you." That night, Shaq sat alone in his apartment, staring at the glowing thread through half-lidded eyes. There was a strange detachment in the way people debated his work, the way they tried to decode him. It reminded him of sports analysts years ago, dissecting his form, his footwork, his free-throw technique, like he was a lab sample. Only now, it was his mind on display. He thought of Darian, of Lucille, of Shawnee. He closed the tab. That same week, a quiet moment unfolded in the lower stacks of the Eastworth Library. Shaq was scanning a set of advanced journals on applied differential theory when a voice interrupted. "I just wanted to say, thank you." He turned to see Nicolette Vance, the reserve junior who usually sat 2 rows in front of him in Braxley's class. Her eyes didn't dart. They held. "For what?" he asked, gently. She swallowed. "For staying." Shaq tilted his head, unsure what she meant. "This program, it wears people like us down," she continued. "I've almost transferred twice. I kept thinking maybe it's just me. But when you walked in, and didn't shrink, even when they tried to box you in, I don't know. It made me want to stay too." Shaq didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "Staying ain't always strength. Sometimes it's stubbornness." Nicolette smiled faintly. "Either way it matters." They stood there for a beat, in a quiet that felt earned. And something passed between them, not romance, not flattery, but recognition. 2 minds shaped by pressure, sharing the same storm. After she left, Shaq sat down, pulled out his notebook and flipped to a blank page. At the top he wrote, "Proof of presence." The campus kept buzzing. Numerium updated the post with an editor's note. "User Titan of Tangents has not responded to any messages or offers. Identity unknown." But speculation continued. On a radio show, a Stanford professor guessed, "Definitely someone postdoc. No undergrad writes like that." On a podcast, a grad student whispered, "I think it's a woman. The logic flows like a narrative. There's rhythm in it." And on Eastworth campus, Braxley made one final move. He issued a formal request to the department chair, an inquiry into anonymous academic leaks for the integrity of future coursework. He didn't name names, but he didn't need to. The chair skimmed the file, eyes narrowing. No student's been accused? Not yet, Braxley said. But I suspect we'll find one. The chair didn't smile. Be sure it's worth the chase, Ellington. Sometimes genius has a way of writing its own credentials. Shaq wasn't present for any of those conversations. But he could feel the walls shifting, not closing in, opening. And though he never claimed the title, Titan of Tangents lived on. Not as a post, but as a reminder. That sometimes, when the world doubts your mind, you don't fight it with fists. You answer with silence. And let the math speak. There was no denying it anymore. The man sitting silently at the back of Calculus 3, solving boundary problems like lullabies, wasn't just some outlier student. He was Big Shaq. And for Braxley, that revelation wasn't awe-inspiring. It was infuriating. Because it reframed everything. The flawless exam, the viral solutions, the way the class and the world beyond it had begun to whisper his name with reverence. It wasn't just intellectual brilliance anymore. It was celebrity, and Braxley couldn't stand the thought that a man known for athletic dominance, media charisma, and brand empires could walk into his carefully controlled academic realm and outthink everyone, including him. That week, under the guise of curricular integrity, Braxley requested a closed-door meeting with the university's academic ethics committee. The kind of meeting that wasn't advertised, that didn't make the calendar, that happened behind locked doors and quiet nods. 6 chairs surrounded the conference table. Deans, department heads, compliance officers. And Braxley, standing with his usual cold calm, began the presentation with a tap of the projector remote. I come here today, he said with concern over an anomaly in our academic system. He gestured to the slide, a blurred image of Shaq solving a triple integral on the whiteboard during the first week of class. This student, enrolled as Shaquille L, has demonstrated mathematical performance not only inconsistent with the expected curve, but identical, word for word, to content recently leaked to the public on a high-traffic math forum, a forum frequently used by graduate researchers and competitive scholars. He clicked again. Up came the now famous Titan of Tangents post. Whether this is the work of a ghostwriter, an unauthorized collaborator, or the student himself is beside the point. What matters is the violation of trust. This individual is not who he claims to be. He is Shaquille O'Neal, a retired athlete, media personality, and known public figure. He enrolled under partial identity. He has received unearned attention, and now he is compromising our academic integrity. The committee exchanged glances. Unease drifted in the room like fog. One of the deans finally spoke. Ellington, with respect, are you alleging that Mr. O'Neal didn't do his own work? I'm saying, Braxley replied, that if we don't investigate this fully, we're setting a precedent that visibility outranks merit. That spectacle replaces scholarship. The room remained silent until the door opened, and in walked Mr. Darien, the janitor. The man who mopped the halls and vanished before sunrise. The man with no ID tag, no faculty listing, no office. Every head turned. He walked in holding a binder wrapped in rubber bands, spine frayed, pages overflowing with handwritten notes and diagrams. His eyes swept the room once before he spoke. I believe I can clear this up. Braxley stiffened. This is a confidential meeting, Mr. Dr. Darien McClare, he said evenly, laying the binder down with a gentle thud. PhD in Applied Mathematics. Howard University. Class of... The room froze. Did some teaching, he added. Did some research. And then, like many others, got erased before tenure became mine. You know how it goes. He turned to the committee. I've been tutoring your student, Mr. O'Neal, since the beginning of the semester. Not because he needed answers, but because he needed sharpening. You all think he's just a name, just a face. But what I saw was a mind built like architecture, strong, intentional, and still building. He opened the binder, flipping pages with care. These are Shaquille's personal notebooks. They're not assignments. They're not downloads. These are the notes of a man thinking for himself. Original theories, experimental derivations. He's been drafting his own modifications to fluid dynamics models. Something we're not even teaching yet. And this, he held up a page, is a new method for isolating variable curvature in topological space. No one gave him that. He found it. Braxley's voice cracked through the quiet. Anyone can fabricate a binder. Darien raised an eyebrow. Then I assume you can explain this line here. He pointed to a section that used a rare tensor folding technique. one Darian had published in a long-forgotten paper in a discontinued academic journal. Braxley's mouth opened, then closed again. Another committee member leaned forward. Are you saying Shaquille developed this independently? I'm saying, Darian said slowly, that Shaquille is not just a student, he's a mathematician, one you didn't see coming. The room shifted. The power balance flipped. By the end of the meeting, the decision wasn't final, but it was clear. A formal inquiry would proceed, not against Shaq, but into the broader implications of academic bias and faculty conduct. And in the interim, Shaq would remain enrolled, pending a public academic review. Word got out fast. Within 24 hours, emails flew, whispers spread, and campus bulletin boards were covered in anonymous flyers with one bold sentence. When truth makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's not truth that's the problem. That evening, Shaq sat quietly in his apartment, notebook open but untouched. He hadn't asked Darian to come, hadn't expected him to, but the moment he heard about it, something deep in his chest buried under years of armor swelled. His phone buzzed. A message from Nicolette. I heard. They're watching now, but so are we. Keep going. He stared at the message, then closed his eyes. He thought of Lucille, of Shawnee, of that young version of himself, pressing dominoes into the carpet, wondering if numbers could ever matter as much as fame. And now, they did. The next morning, campus felt split down the middle. Some students avoided eye contact. Others stared like he was made of equations himself. But Shaq didn't flinch. He showed up to class, took his seat in the back, opened his book. Braxley walked in 15 minutes late, face unreadable, words clipped. He didn't address the meeting, didn't mention the inquiry. He simply wrote 3 problems on the board and told the class to begin. But his hands trembled. Shaq didn't look up. He worked. Calm, measured. And this time when he finished, he didn't walk to the front. He stayed in his seat, let the numbers speak for him. The board may have belonged to Braxley, but the room now belonged to truth. And truth had finally shown its coordinates. But on this morning, that silence was shattered by the murmur of over 200 people packed into rows. Students, professors, alumni, a few reporters clutching notepads, even members of the board. The buzz wasn't just about curiosity, it was about reckoning. The kind people whisper about in halls before they realize history is happening in real time. On the left side of the stage, sitting with a legal representative from the university, was Professor Ellington Braxley. Polished, unreadable, posture like steel. In front of him, a thin folder of evidence, each page tabbed with surgical precision. He sat as if the outcome was already assured. On the right side, dressed in a black sweater and slacks, was Shaquille O'Neal. Silent, composed with his hands folded across a plain notebook. No entourage, no spotlight, just a man with something to prove, and nothing to lose. The moderator, a senior dean from the School of Ethics, cleared her throat, silencing the audience. We are here today to address allegations of academic misconduct and misrepresentation. Professor Braxley, you may proceed. Braxley stood without hesitation, buttoning his jacket. Colleagues, students, members of the board, he began. I present to you not a witch hunt, but a call for standards. This institution, esteemed as it is, has a duty to protect the sanctity of academic achievement, and I believe that duty has been compromised. He walked toward the podium, sliding one document beneath the camera lens for the overhead projector. It was the Tighten Off Tangents forum post, familiar to most in the room now, though its contents still carried electricity. This post, Braxley said, identical in structure to a recent exam submitted by Mr. Shaquille L., appeared online within days of our midterm. The author remains anonymous, and yet the work has circulated globally, drawing undue attention to our campus and compromising the integrity of my course. He clicked to another slide, Shaq's student profile, showing his registered name and limited transcript. Mr. O'Neal, enrolled under a derivative of his full name. That in itself is not unlawful, but misleading. It obscured his public identity, and in doing so, placed him above suspicion. Now, with his celebrity amplified by academic praise, we must ask, was this brilliance authentic, or orchestrated? He paused, scanning the room with that cold, controlled smirk. In my experience, when performance exceeds probability, scrutiny must follow. The moderator nodded. Thank you, Professor Braxley. Mr. O'Neal, your response. Shaq stood slowly. He didn't touch the mic. He didn't need to. He began not with rebuttal, but with memory. I've walked into a lot of rooms where I wasn't expected to speak, he said. Rooms where people expected me to perform, or entertain, or nod politely while someone else explained the world to me. But this one's different. He paused, letting the words breathe. I came to Eastworth because I love math. Because when I was a kid, my mom used to turn numbers into games. And when I played ball and broke down angles, arcs, reaction times, it was all numbers, all logic. The court made sense to me because math made sense to me, not in a textbook way, in a life way. He turned slightly toward Braxley. And when I stepped into your class, Professor, I knew I'd have to work twice as hard to be seen as half as capable. Not because I lacked knowledge, but because I didn't fit your definition of who belongs in a room like this. There was no anger in his tone. Just wait.
I didn't post my exam online.
But I'm not here to argue anonymity. I'm here because this isn't just about a test. This is about the systems we don't talk about. The quiet assumptions. The labels we place on people before they've said a word. You didn't question my work because it was wrong. You questioned it because you couldn't imagine me doing it. He opened his notebook, flipped to a fresh page, and walked to the whiteboard behind him. Some of you came here to see a defense. I'd rather offer an idea. And with that, he began to write. The room shifted from courtroom to classroom. He presented a known unsolved problem from applied topology, one whispered about in academic circles, but rarely approached in public, especially not without preparation. He didn't just solve it, he reframed it. He presented a new theorem, a fluid reinterpretation of the classic constraint, using rotational matrices in higher dimensional spaces. He worked slowly, clearly, and at each step the logic held. You could hear breaths catch. A few students leaned forward, scribbling on their own notepads, eyes wide. And then, when he paused, chalk still in hand, he said, "You don't need to know my name to see the math. You just have to be willing to look past the assumptions." Silence. Complete, total silence. Until one faculty member cleared his throat and almost involuntarily muttered, That's correct." The moderator turned to Braxley. "Professor, do you have a response?" Braxley rose, a beat slower than before. He looked older now, tighter in the face. The certainty that once animated his spine had dulled. I don't dispute the solution," he said, voice thin. "Then allow me," the moderator said, "to pose a question to you. In your testimony, you emphasized consistency, the probability of performance. May I ask? If a student presented a theory combining polar transformations with variable topology in multi-axis systems, would you be able to confirm its validity unaided?" Braxley hesitated. "I would need time." Shaq turned, stepped aside from the board, and gently said, "Would you like me to walk you through it?" Gasps rose around the room, not at the offer, but at the grace inside it. Braxley stood frozen. The moderator paused, then addressed the panel. "We've heard both arguments. The committee will now deliberate." The lights dimmed slightly, as the panel gathered in whispers behind a glass door. Shaq returned to his seat. Lucille, seated quietly in the front row, had tears in her eyes, not loud, not dramatic, just steady. She clutched a worn photograph of a younger Shaq in graduation robes, back when he first promised to return to school one day for himself. 20 minutes passed. Then the panel returned. The senior dean cleared her throat. "We find no evidence of academic dishonesty. Mr. O'Neill's work stands on its own merit, and demonstrates not only comprehension but innovation. We therefore dismiss the charges entirely." A pause. "However, upon review of grading records, communication history and departmental protocol, we are placing Professor Braxley on temporary suspension pending a full investigation into academic misconduct, including bias and manipulation of evaluation standards." The audience didn't erupt. They exhaled. A long-held breath released. And in that moment, Shaq didn't smile. He simply looked down at his hands, the same hands that once broke backboards, now holding the weight of something more lasting. Later, as the crowd thinned, Lucille approached the stage. "Told you," she whispered, brushing his cheek with her hand. "Concrete don't crack." Shaq nodded, voice quiet. "Meh, it wasn't just me." "No, baby," she said. "But it sure started with you." Outside, the sky had turned gold with late afternoon light. The news would travel fast. Articles would be written, theories debated, podcasts recorded. But for now, in this moment, there were no cameras, no microphones, just the hum of a room, where something important had happened. Not a victory, a correction. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. The applause was soft, reverent, not explosive like the roars Shaq was used to under arena lights, but full of warmth, full of truth. It filled the modest auditorium where Eastworth's mid-year cohort gathered for a small, intimate graduation ceremony. There were no spotlight cameras, no celebrity cameos, no honorary degrees this time. Just students, faculty, and families gathered in rows of folding chairs, watching a man too tall for the podium lean forward and speak from somewhere quieter than victory, from resolution. Shaquille didn't wear a gown. He hadn't walked the full course to a diploma. He wasn't crossing any official stage today. But when the dean gently asked if he'd offer closing remarks to the graduating class, just a few words, he had nodded. Not out of pride, out of gratitude, and because he had something he needed to leave behind. He stepped to the mic, towering over it, his voice low but clear. I came to this school not because I needed a title. I've had titles. MVP, All-Star, Doctor from a few places. But titles fade. Purpose doesn't. The room was still. I sat in the back of a lecture hall so no one would see me first. I wore the hoodie, kept my head down, tried not to outshine the curve. But some things, no matter how much you dim them, they don't go dark. And this? He raised his notebook. This was always part of me. I just forgot it for a while. He glanced at Nicolette in the front row. Her eyes were full. Next to her, Mr. Darien sat with a small smile, his tie crooked in a way that said he hadn't worn one in years. Shaq continued. There are two kinds of power in the world. The kind that builds walls to keep people out, and the kind that builds doors so others can walk through. I'm done with walls. He paused, then nodded once, softly. Thank you. All of you. And just like that he stepped back. It was the only speech he gave that spring. Short, precise, like a good proof, simple on the surface, but deeply intentional underneath. The news of his exoneration had already rippled through academic circles. The suspension of Professor Braxley sparked debates from think pieces to round-table panels. Eastworth had issued a formal apology behind closed doors, then tried to pivot the narrative by offering Shaq a guest lecturing position, even suggesting a collaborative paper on educational reform in STEM. He declined. He wasn't interested in vindication. He was interested in impact. In the months that followed, Shaq quietly founded the Lucille Project, named after his mother, a national mentorship initiative aimed at supporting Black students in math and analytical sciences. Not just tutoring, not just scholarships, but real immersion, coding camps in underserved schools, virtual theory labs, live video sessions with mathematicians who looked like the students they were speaking to. The mission was simple: change the equation. Lucille herself recorded the welcome video. She sat in front of a chalkboard and looked into the camera like she was looking at her own children. Every child has a mind worth exploring, she said, and every number has a name behind it. Let's teach them both. Nicolette came on board as the first regional lead. She left Eastworth a semester early to begin working full-time in Baltimore, setting up the first local Lucille hub. Her joy didn't come from escape. It came from building something she had once thought impossible. Darien returned to academia for the first time in 27 years. This time not as a faculty adjunct, but as a guest researcher for an open-access journal Shaq helped fund. His first published paper in over 2 decades landed as the lead in their relaunch issue, on the possibility of structural equity in mathematical language. As for Shaq, he didn't hang a diploma on his wall. He didn't care to. Instead, in his Atlanta home, one wall was now filled with student letters, handwritten notes, doodles from second graders who drew him in chalk solving problems on a basketball court, email screenshots from high schoolers saying they'd never thought of math as something they were allowed to love, every single one taped with care. That summer, when a journalist from a major network asked why he hadn't stayed on at Eastworth to teach, Shaq answered without hesitation, I didn't want a room, I wanted a ripple. The article went viral, but again Shaq didn't lean into the moment. He disappeared from media for a while, traveled, visited the first Lucille hubs in Detroit and Charlotte, walked into classrooms unannounced, sat with students, solved problems on whiteboards, then erased his name and let them take over. He told them, the goal isn't to be the smartest in the room. The goal is to make sure more people get to be in the room. At one hub in Oakland, a 12-year-old named Elijah asked him, were you always good at math? Shaq chuckled. Not always. I was always curious. Curiosity's the real muscle. Even when people thought you weren't smart, especially then. The boy nodded, then returned to a geometry puzzle he was building with Lego bricks and graph paper. Shaq watched him for a moment before walking out into the warm California sun, his heart full. The ripple had begun. Back at Eastworth, things were changing. Braxley was quietly reassigned. A new ethics committee was formed. The math department launched an inclusive pathways initiative. Though many students whispered that the system was still slow, still stubborn, but they couldn't erase what had happened. They couldn't erase the chalkboard Shaq had written on, the theory he'd unveiled live, the sound of an entire room holding its breath, while a man broke a pattern no one thought he could touch. He'd left the university, yes, but he left it changed. In his final days on campus, before heading south to begin full-time work on the Lucille project, Shaq visited room 204 one last time. The lecture hall was empty. The sunlight filtered through the windows in long, dusty beams. He stood at the front, the whiteboard still faintly marked from recent classwork. He picked up a marker and wrote just one line. "Let your work be the loudest part of you." Then he capped the pen, walked out, left the door open. Outside, the trees swayed gently, as if nodding in quiet approval. He didn't need applause. He'd already become the thing he came here to find. A genius not despite the giants, but among them. The alley was quiet except for the sound of chalk scraping against brick. The building's wall, tagged and worn from years of city life, now hosted something entirely unexpected. Not graffiti, not gang symbols, but equations. Not simple ones either. Differential calculus, integration by parts, tangent lines colliding across broken concrete like they were meant to be there all along. A boy, maybe 13, maybe younger, stood on an overturned milk crate. Hoodie too big, sneakers scuffed, eyes full of fire. He scribbled quickly, as if trying to outrun his own thoughts. His knuckles were scraped, not from fights, from clinging to metal fences while fleeing distractions the world kept throwing at him. But this moment? This was peace. His shirt hung loosely off his shoulders, faded navy blue with a white print that read, "Titan of Tangents." Across the street, partially tucked into the shadow of a shuttered barber shop, stood a figure, still massive, though softened by time, taller than most, broader than all, and wrapped in a long coat that barely hid the familiar frame. Shaquille O'Neal stood with hands in his pockets, watching the boy work, his eyes fixed not on the math but on the rhythm. The boy erased a mistake, rewrote the function, paused, then smirked. Shaq smiled too. He didn't speak, didn't approach, just observed. Not as a teacher, not as a celebrity, but as something deeper, a witness. A few more minutes passed. The boy finished his problem, circled the answer like it was gold, then jumped down from the crate. He stuffed the chalk into his pocket, glanced around the empty alley with a quiet pride, and took off running, disappearing down the street like a flash of pure potential. Shaq didn't follow. He exhaled, deeply, then turned and began walking the other way. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city. The neighborhood looked like the ones he'd grown up near. Corners with too many liquor stores, and not enough libraries. Buildings held together by resilience and paint. Blocks where the sound of ambition was often drowned out by survival. But change had come. Quietly. You couldn't always see it in the skyline, but you could see it in the details. In shirts like that boy's, in chalk dust on brick, in the cracked sidewalk where someone had etched Lucille Project Tutoring Tuesdays 4 p.m. with a dull stick. Shaq walked past it, head bowed slightly, letting the moment wrap around him. It had been 10 years since Eastworth. 10 years since the trial, the theorem, the exoneration. 10 years since he left the university, without a diploma, but with something far more permanent. The Lucille Project had grown far beyond what he had imagined. It started as mentorship, evolved into innovation, national partnerships, public school integrations, interactive platforms that combined math with music, sports, street art, meeting kids where they lived, and teaching them in the language of their own lives. But Shaq didn't run the show anymore. He had stepped back 5 years ago, handing the reins to Nicolette, who now led the entire organization with the same quiet fire she'd once carried into lecture halls. Mr. Darian had passed 2 years prior peacefully, at home, surrounded by stacks of journals and the final draft of a book he'd co-authored with a student from Brooklyn, named Isaiah. Shaq gave the eulogy. It was brief, Darian would have hated anything too grand. Now as he turned the corner and stepped into a small neighborhood cafe, a bell jingled overhead. The barista, a young woman in her 20s, glanced up from the register, paused mid-sentence, then blinked in recognition. "You're..." Shaq smiled gently. "I'm just here for coffee." She nodded slowly, still unsure whether to ask for a selfie or pretend she hadn't seen a ghost from her childhood TV commercials. She made the drink, handed it over, then said quietly, "My little brother's in Lucille's South Side. Changed his whole game." Shaq tapped the lid in appreciation. "Tell him to keep building. Curiosity wins races most people don't even know they're running." He stepped back outside, sipping the drink, as the wind picked up, rustling the leaves along the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn blared, followed by laughter. The city moved on. He walked for another block, turned down a quieter street, and arrived at a mural painted across an old school building. It showed a faceless figure, half in a graduation cap, half in a basketball jersey, rising through a fractal pattern of numbers and constellations. At the base of the painting, someone had spray painted, "The mind is a muscle too." Shaq stood there for a long time, watching, remembering, not just the trials, the tests, the boardroom battles, but the small things, the domino games, with Lucille, Shawnee sliding a math book across a hotel bed, Nicolette's trembling voice in the library stacks, Darian's cracked thermos filled with cold coffee and sharper truths. The little things that added up. He pulled out his phone, not to text, not to call, but to open his notes. The latest entry, dated the night before. "Let the kid fail the first time. Let them feel the struggle.
That's the beginning of real learning.
Don't hand them the solution. Hand them the mirror." He locked the screen, smiled. From a nearby rooftop, a drone buzzed past, carrying a small banner ad for an upcoming Lucille Project conference. He didn't need to be on the panel, didn't want to be. Let others speak now. Let others lead. He had never wanted to be the answer. He only ever wanted to be the variable. The thing that changed the equation. A soft voice echoed in his mind, his own years earlier, barely a whisper. "Sometimes the world doesn't need to know your name. Only your purpose." He crossed the street. The boys' chalk equations were already beginning to fade with the wind, dusting the sidewalk in specks of white and proof. Shaq didn't stop. He didn't take a photo. He just walked forward, disappearing into the city's motion. No spotlight, no encore, just a ripple. The legend of Big Shaq didn't retire with a jersey. It kept solving, kept inspiring, kept making space, in classrooms, in corners, in conversations that used to leave kids out. Because sometimes the greatest proof of genius isn't how loud it arrives, but how quietly it echoes. If this story made you pause, think deeper, or see brilliance in a new light, good. Because the real equation isn't solved in one classroom, one voice, or one name. It continues in every mind that dares to question, reimagine, and rise. Stay curious. Stay disruptive. Stay in the rooms they never built for you. Genius isn't a gift. It's a choice to keep solving when they say you shouldn't.